There is a tiny Christian country that has been under endless attack, losing more than 1 million of its people and forcing nearly 2 million more to leave their homeland. But this isn't the Middle East. This is the small, often overlooked Caucasus. And here's the twist. While Russia, this country's so-called longtime protector, stood aside and did nothing, India stepped in. Not with promises or speeches, but with weapons, missiles, radars, and artillery worth billions of dollars. Why is India, thousands of kilometers away, sending some of its most advanced weapons to a nation many people can't even locate on a map? What country is this? What risks is New Delhi taking? And what hidden game is unfolding here? That's where the story begins. To understand why India is supplying weapons here, we need to go back to this nation's painful history. For centuries it was caught between mighty empires, Persian, Ottoman, Russian and Turkish. Each of them took parts of its land. What was once a large, proud country was eventually cut down to a fragile strip of territory. And the suffering didn't stop there. In the early 20th century, it faced one of the darkest tragedies in history. Over 1 million of its people were massacred, and more than 2 million forced to run for their lives. Whole families were scattered forever, leaving behind villages that never came back to life. This little Christian nation should have had a shield. Its survival depended on a strong ally to the north, Russia. For decades, that bond seemed firm. But when war returned in recent years, that ally stood by silently. And in just one day, this nation lost the land it had fought to keep for generations. So, who filled the space Russia abandoned? That is where India suddenly appeared, heavily armed. But why would India involve itself in a distant and bloody conflict? The nation in question is Armenia, a Christian country surrounded by powerful neighbors, Turkey, Azerbaijan and Iran. For years, Armenia depended almost entirely on Russia for its defense. More than 90% of its weapons once came from Moscow. But when the wars of 2020 and 2023 broke out in Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia stayed out. Moscow's silence was deafening. That betrayal changed everything. Armenia realized it could no longer trust its supposed protector. It needed another lifeline, and it needed one quickly. To the surprise of many, it found that support in India. But why India? Why not Europe, the US, or even China? In 2022, Armenia signed military deals worth more than $250 million with New Delhi. Soon after, more contracts followed, raising the total close to $1 billion. These weren't symbolic gestures. India delivered Akash air defense systems, Pinaka multi-barrel rocket launchers, Swathi counter-battery radars, anti-tank missiles, and prepared to send up to 170 artillery guns. For a country as small as Armenia, this was a huge amount of firepower. Weapons that could slow Azerbaijan's push, challenge Turkish drones, and restore some balance on the battlefield. But India wasn't simply acting as a savior. It had its own interests, and they all connect to one country, Turkey. Turkey openly supports Pakistan's view on Kashmir, calling it occupied territory. For India, that is a line that cannot be crossed. So every weapon sent to Armenia is not just about defending a small ally. It's also about pushing back against Turkey's ambitions. And Turkey's ambitions go further than many realize. Its vision of a pan-Turkic empire, a corridor running from Turkey through Azerbaijan into Central Asia, cuts directly through Armenian land. This is the so-called Zangezur corridor. If Turkey and Azerbaijan succeed, Armenia could lose even more ground. And for India, that would mean Ankara and by extension Islamabad gaining a dangerous advantage. So India's role is not just about helping Armenia survive, it is also about protecting its own position. But these weapons don't travel directly. They pass through another country, and that changes the entire picture. Here's the hidden part. India's weapons did not always go straight into Armenia. They first moved through Iran, yes, the very same country often seen as Moscow's partner against the West, was quietly helping India supply Armenia. Convoys moved across Iran and entered Armenia through the Norduz border. Why would Tehran, normally cautious about Moscow's influence, allow this? Because Iran had its own motives. To its north lies Azerbaijan, a country deeply tied to Israel. And Israel didn't just support Baku politically, it provided nearly 70% of Azerbaijan's weapons before the 2020 war. So for Tehran, a stronger Armenia wasn't only about supporting a neighbor, it was also about blocking Israel's influence from moving further up its northern frontier. But this fragile cooperation didn't last long. By April 2024, Iran suddenly stopped the shipments. Why? Most likely because of pressure from Moscow. Russia may not have defended Armenia when war broke out, but that doesn't mean it wants India or anyone else taking its place. For Putin, the Caucasus is not negotiable. Too much Turkish presence means NATO's shadow moves closer. Too much Indian involvement could push Armenia further away from Moscow. Either way, Russia risks losing control of what it still considers its backyard, so Iran closed the route. The hidden passage was gone, leaving Armenia once again stuck between stronger powers pulling in opposite directions. And still, the situation kept shifting. Because while Moscow worried about control, Turkey and Azerbaijan pressed ahead with their most daring plan, the Zangezur Corridor. If they succeed, Armenia will be split in half and Turkey will secure a direct land link to Azerbaijan and Central Asia. For Ankara, it would be the path toward a pan-Turkic empire. For Baku, it would be a historic win. For Armenia, it would be an existential threat. And for India, it is a red line. Because every move Turkey makes in the Caucasus indirectly boosts Pakistan's hand against New Delhi. In other words, Armenia's future is no longer just its own concern. It is tied to India's rivalry with Pakistan, Turkey's big ambitions, Russia's shrinking influence, and Iran's security fears. But there is still one more player shaping this conflict quietly: Israel. Its support for Azerbaijan is not only about arms sales, it is also about containing its greatest enemy, Iran. With a stronger Azerbaijan sitting on Iran's northern border, Israel gains leverage, and the United States secures another presence near the Caspian Sea. This is what makes the conflict so explosive. Armenia's collapse would open the way for a pro-Israel, pro-Turkey corridor surrounding Iran and cutting down Russia's sphere of influence. And that is why India's shipments, though smaller compared to superpower aid, matter a great deal. They are not just guns and rockets, they are a signal. India is telling the world, we are prepared to project our power even in Russia's old backyard, even against Turkey's empire vision. The question remains, will India's gamble succeed, or will it drag New Delhi into a far bigger fight than it imagined? So here we stand, a tiny Christian country struggling to survive among giants, and India stepping in with weapons that might shift the balance of power. But with Russia pulling back, Turkey pressing forward, Iran blocking supply lines, and Israel watching quietly from the sidelines, Armenia's future is anything but certain. And here is the truth. Crafting stories like this takes hours of digging through history, strategy, and sources, because the goal is to give you the full picture, not just shallow headlines. If you found this story meaningful, the best way you can help is simple. Share it with someone who cares about history and geopolitics. And if you want more deep dives like this one, subscribe. It keeps the work alive and brings you the next story. Until then, stay curious, because the world is far more connected than it looks on the map.